We're going to be live. Okay, here we are. Welcome everyone to the Wizard of Radical Self-Respect. Today, I have Chelsey Brooke Cole, who is a psychotherapist and author of If Only I'd Known. Today, we're going to talk about a few different things. One is going to be the roles in the narcissistic family. Two, co-parenting, or counter-parenting as they'll call it in the world. And then how to get over ruminating over the narcissist and to move on. But those are the three things that we're definitely going to cover. We might cover more too. But thank you very much for joining me today, Chelsey. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. And as we were just talking about, I have two cats. They might make an appearance. One is in my lap right now. So if you see me shifting around and his tail might hit the microphone. So might be a cat video too.
Well, people won't complain about that. They all like
Nope.
the animals. They do love the animal. What are their names?
The one in my lap is Kit, and then the other one's Oreo. You can tell that we like chocolate or candy around here. Kit Kat and Oreo.
Cheat meal of choice is the Oreos.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
very good, very good. So the narcissistic families and the roles in the narcissistic family. You have a narcissistic parent, and then there's probably more of a codependent, easygoing enabler parent. And then there's maybe a golden child, a scapegoat, or a black sheep. What kinds of people in your experience are the most likely to get help? Who do you see the most in your practice?
You know, it's interesting because any role can get help. And I think with social media and more information, people are starting to put the pieces together and start to identify and say, oh, maybe I've been the golden child or the scapegoat or the invisible child or the lost child, whichever one that they're resonating with. Any of them can get help. But what I often find, at least for me in my therapy and coaching practice, is a lot of times it's the scapegoat that ends up in therapy, and maybe not surprisingly, because the scapegoat kind of holds the narcissistic family's shame. They're the one that gets blamed for everything. They're the problem child. They're the one that the family has to fix, or, you know, because narcissists are never going to take personal responsibility. So if anything is going wrong, if they're not getting the accolades they want as a parent, if their life isn't going well, then it's going to be because this child is difficult, or this child just, you know, struggled more in school, or they have to make up a reason why this child isn't performing and doing exactly what they want. So the scapegoat is the one who grows up and often feels very heavy, a great amount of shame and guilt. And interestingly, they can also end up being the truth teller, or they kind of play that double role where they're the scapegoat. They're the one who gets blamed for the family problems. But at the same time, that might be because they're seeing things and they're seeing the narcissistic family and calling it out. And we all know narcissists do not like to be called out. They don't like taking accountability. You're going to blame somebody else if you try to hold them accountable. So because of that, I see the scapegoats, the truth tellers in therapy, and also the people pleasers or the helpers or the fixers of the family, because they push and push and push until they're exhausted, and either they have some kind of physical health concern, they're crashing mentally and emotionally, they have panic attacks or anxiety attacks. They're usually coming in therapy for something like anxiety or depression or hypervigilance. They don't necessarily know they're in a narcissistic family yet and what impact that's playing. But those two I see a lot in my practice.
So a people pleaser, are they often the scapegoat? Are those two usually linked, or does it, you don't really see much of a pattern with that?
I think I would separate them, because the helper is usually the one who's trying to keep the peace and trying to stay safe by following the rules.
Okay.
By trying very hard to please the narcissistic parent, and just their mindset is, if I just will address whatever issue comes up, I'll just address the problem, then everything will be okay. So they're working very hard, but of course the goalpost is always moving with narcissistic parents and narcissists in general. So that people pleaser, the helper, just thinks, if I just do this next thing, I'll just, you know, do what they want in this situation. I will call them this many times a day. I'll show up for what they want. I'll do what they want, and then we'll be okay. Of course, it's never okay, because the narcissist always gives you something else to work on.
Right.
This scapegoat isn't usually the one who is trying to make things better by pleasing everybody.
Okay. I'm glad we make that distinction there too. And this is where the earning love thing comes into play too, right?
Yeah.
This is where when the goalposts are constantly being moved and shifted, that's the earning love thing. They're trying to jump through the hoops, they're trying to please the narcissistic
Yeah.
parent, but those goalposts keep moving and they learn, or maybe they don't ever learn, that nothing they do is good enough. And
Exactly.
one of the things you mentioned in our last show is one of the things a narcissistic person is great at making people feel is not enough. So,
Yep.
and that's the origins, I would say.
That's the mantra for all narcissistic relationships, is that you never feel enough. Like if we could just sum up narcissistic relationships and how they make you feel, they make you feel like they're not enough.
Right.
I've shared that repeatedly in my journey. Like I grew up with a neglectful narcissist father. I feel like the goalposts were always moving. I was valued for what I did or how I could perform, or if I did something that he could brag about or that was important to him and his circle, then it was important. But if I wanted to do something else that he wasn't interested in, it was like, don't care.
Right.
So I kind of grew up with that mentality of, oh, I just have to work really hard. You have to work really hard to get people to love you, appreciate you. I'm used to doing. So of course I found myself in several adult narcissistic relationships until I finally hit the wall and was like, I will sacrifice my whole life if I don't stop looking at potential instead of reality.
Right, exactly. And at least you did figure it out too. That's the important part. And because some people just don't. How about the golden child though? What do you see in regards to the golden child? And my guess would be sometimes they may turn into the narcissist themselves, but not always. But what do you see with the golden child?
They can. And the golden child is the one who is the narcissistic family supply. So the golden child is the one who, maybe you have a narcissistic dad and he was a really great baseball player, and then he has a son. His son is also a really talented baseball player. But let's say he has a sister who prefers to do art. Well, narcissistic dad doesn't care about art. So she gets pushed to the side, ignored. He doesn't care about her, but your brother, this is what he's doing. Like they'll make accommodations where can't go to your art show, can't make it, but we'll move schedules and stop the world to be able to make it to, son's baseball game. So this is the child that is getting the family or the narcissistic parents validation, supply, attention. They can brag about them. They can talk about them with their colleagues. It's kind of what fuels their own narcissistic ego. Right. But surprisingly, you would think that, okay, a golden child is going to be the best role to have in a family because they're going to get praised. And partly, yes, they do. But at the same time, the amount of pressure that the golden child feels to perform, they sometimes are jealous of the scapegoat or of the other siblings, if there are other siblings in the family, because maybe those other siblings got ignored, which is its own kind of pain. But maybe the narcissist didn't push them into a mold as much as the golden child. The golden child has a trajectory. Narcissistic parent wants this for you, and that's the only option. So the golden child can also suffer a lot too, can end up being the narcissist, like you said, but can also carry a lot of guilt and shame and almost like a moral injury. Like we'll see when people go through difficulties and maybe they've harmed other people. Let's say they're in a cult or something, and you find that you've done things that really out of character, but you did it because of the cult you were in. And then you feel bad about what you did because you were in that environment. Same thing with the golden child. They may carry shame and guilt because maybe they treated their siblings in a poor way, but they didn't realize what was going on and how the narcissistic parent was using them. So that can actually be a really heavy role too.
Sure. No, I could definitely see that. I mean, I can relate to that in my own life too, where and things kind of get passed down, right? Where people, the parent passes things down to the children, maybe things that happen at school, the kids come back and they take that out on the younger siblings. It can be a bad pattern that unless someone puts their foot down, it can keep on continuing. Problem is a lot of people don't know that. Like they don't recognize that in the moment when it's happening. Now, the other thing, the narcissistic parent, whatever they idealize, whatever their version of supply is, that will probably determine what child will be the golden child. Like the person that lives up to that vision or their fantasy of what they would want their children to be. In your example, the dad really likes baseball. And then the son, he also is into baseball and is really good. So it makes
Yeah.
sense that that's the golden child. But say if it was something else, maybe if the dad was really into music or art,
Hmm.
and then the kid that is most like that would be the golden child in that case. So
Yep.
it's interesting to see how it would play out.
Yeah, it's not a, particular hobby or interest. Narcissistic parents see their children as extensions of themselves. So it's like they are benefiting from how the child is succeeding in life.
Right.
It's not about the child, and they'll say how proud they are of the child and what they're doing. Maybe part of them is, but more than anything, they're proud of how it reflects on them.
Mm, absolutely. And they'll say they have kids to get their own needs met as opposed to meeting the needs of their children. And a lot of it is as shallow as just image. A lot of it is, how does it look to the outside? Am I going
Hmm.
to get supply? Am I going to get the 3 A's, attention, admiration, and acknowledgement for how my children are acting? And that could also be why they want them to stay in toxic relationships sometimes. They'll say well-meaning things in some cases, but don't give up, or love conquers
Mm,
all, and all of these things
mm,
that might not be too good, but they just don't want the image of, oh, my child got divorced, or my
right.
child isn't with their mom or their baby dad or baby mom. And they don't,
How that's gonna look to the
yeah.
family.
And it's so silly, but that
Yeah.
is what it is a lot of times in those cases.
It is, yeah, because narcissists don't like to do the hard work of parenting. They don't want to deal with the homework and the bad
Right.
days and the breakups and the crying and the, teaching your kid how to emotionally regulate. They don't even do that themselves, so they certainly aren't teaching their children. But
True.
they do want the praise that comes from being a good parent. That's why you'll see some narcissistic parents look really invested. They may be at all the PTA meetings, at all the community events, the bake sales. They'll volunteer for their kids, to be at their kids' school. They'll do all the things, and you think, what a good parent. And everyone else around you is saying, "Aren't you so lucky? Your mom or dad cares so much about
Mm,
being here for you and taking you to this and signing you up for this." But within that relationship with the child, it's quite cold. It's quite
mm,
superficial, but on the outside it can look good because that's what they care
right.
about, being seen as a good parent, not being a good parent.
Right. And a lot of it emotionally
Hmm.
unavailable as well, for sure. And you know what I also hear a lot of? A kid will say something like, or and maybe they're adults now, but they'll say, my parents would really ridicule and belittle me behind closed doors, but then out in
Mm-hmm.
public, they'll talk them up and say, oh, my son or daughter is so great. Or I read in an example one time, there was this woman that there was a girl, and the dad was berating her about wearing something a little too provocative behind closed
Mm.
doors. And you're not going to wear that. But then they go out into public, and he would be like, look what a young, beautiful girl she's growing up into, a young, beautiful woman. So the discrepancy between how they're treated in public versus how they're treated behind closed doors, that can be a little crazy making for them too.
So much. And you see the complex layers that gets like why narcissistic relationships are so complex and take so long to peel back those layers
Mm,
and to figure out, especially if you were born into an environment like this, because no child is born who doesn't want their parents' approval or love or attention. We're born with an innate need to feel a sense of belonging and to have our attachment needs met. We want that approval and unconditional love from our parents. And so children of all, kinds are willing to make excuses and justifications to try to make sense of their narcissistic parents' bad behavior. So why they're so critical of them at home, but then praising them in public, a child isn't going to think, well, because they're narcissistic and they want people to think they're a good parent, but they're really not. They don't care about me. You can't even imagine that as a child.
mm,
And what kind of harm would that do? So before the child is ever going to think something bad of the parent, they'll think something bad of themselves. They'll
mm,
say, well, what they really want is they want what's best for me. And so they're really just trying to be a critic of me so that I will be better because they really want me to improve because they just told, Sally, our neighbor, how proud they were of me about what I did and bragged about my accomplishments. So surely they care about me and they want what's best for me. So I just need to try harder. And we're back to never feeling
mm.
enough.
And that's deering, basically, is what that is: defending, excusing, explaining, rationalizing. I tell
Mm,
people, if you catch yourself doing that, consistently, that's
Yeah.
probably an issue. There's something going on with that, where if you're trying to explain away or rationalize their behavior, just like the way you were doing in that example,
Yeah.
that's going to be an issue a lot of times. Now, here's another question for you. The solutions. What are your solutions for someone that has been the scapegoat or the lost child or the golden child? How do they work through these roles? And I guess depending on their role, the work might look a little bit different perhaps, but
Hmm.
what are your recommendations for them?
Hmm. The first step is always making sense of what you've been through. And this touches on the rumination piece that I know we're going to talk about as well. But that's where a lot of people come to me, and where they start their journey is they know something is wrong. Like maybe their gut has been telling them something is wrong, or their health isn't good. They're anxious, they're depressed, they're hypervigilant, they worry all the time. They know something is off, or maybe they know that their family isn't like other families. I think a lot of times that's where kids, as they start to be teens, when they hang out more with friends, will start to say, "Oh, your family can just agree to disagree. Like you can just
Yeah.
have a good time. Like people support you. Like there's not chaos all the time. Like no one's yelling at each other." It's so strange. It's almost like you are on Mars, and you're like, "What are the rules here? I've never been to a place like this before." So it's a slow reveal, because you're really having to peel back the layers of reality, because narcissists create reality when you're growing up. They tell you what is true of you, what to expect from the world. And so what you have to start doing is starting to recognize what you've been through. And whether that's through therapy, that's through coaching, that's through looking at narcissistic family information, kind of writing down the big points of your life and how you felt, perhaps what the parents said and how you actually felt or what actually happened. Hindsight is 2020. It's really hard to put it together going forward, but a lot easier to see looking backward.
That makes sense. And I would say for the scapegoat, like unsubscribing from the distorted version of reality, and
Yeah,
journaling, I think, can really help in that regard too.
so
Just
much.
learning about your thoughts. What are your thinking patterns? What are the distortions? And maybe you need to read them to somebody else so they can point them out to you and say, oh, yeah, that's probably a problematic thing to think about yourself. But
Yeah.
they got to get them on paper because they're probably just the norm. Like it's the norm for them to think those things. They don't know that, oh, this is actually an issue. And that's why it's
Yeah.
important for them to reach out and like go to a therapist like yourself and tell them themselves basically, this is what I'm thinking. These are my thoughts. And that's what needs to be unraveled and unsubscribed from. And like with the golden child, as you said, is a lot of pressure in having to meet your parents' expectations and knowing. It
Mhm.
always reminds me of The Godfather. I don't know if you've seen The Godfather or not, but there's a scene. Have you seen it?
I'm trying to remember if I have. I've seen a lot of those kinds of movies, but I don't know if I've seen that one. I know it's huge. I should have.
Yeah. Yep. You would like it, especially as a therapist. You'd be seeing it through the therapy lens, so it'd be pretty
Yes.
interesting. But there's a scene at the end where this guy Michael is talking to his brother, and his brother, it's an adopted brother, but
Mm.
the adopted brother and the dad were saying, "Oh, we've had a lot of plans for your future." Talking to the
Mm.
little brother, and that's kind of like how it would go, right? They're
Yep.
making plans for your future, and
Yep.
Michael was like, "You're making plans for my future?"
Right.
Like, I'm not the one making plans for my future. And that's kind of exactly what would happen when you're the
Mm.
golden child. They want you to fit that role. They want you to do things a certain way. And your autonomy and your thoughts and feelings about
Mm.
it doesn't matter.
Irrelevant.
Yep.
That's the huge thing, and where I often start, and why I start with clients, and why I love something called internal family systems or parts work, because the role we play in our family becomes so big, we think that's who we are. So if you grew up as the scapegoat or the golden child or the helper or the pleaser, the fixer, whatever, that those roles can get so big, you think, well, I'm just a helper, and then you try to heal, thinking, well, I have to always help. I have to always meet expectations. So you're already trapped in a box.
Mm.
So what I will often work with clients initially to do is say, what part of you says that? Like, does that even feel like adult, autonomous, independent you making that choice? And oftentimes it doesn't. They'll say, no, I kind of feel like a 7 or 8 year old. And I just
Mm.
have to do what mom or dad says. Or I feel like I'm being a defiant teenager and I'm trying to like push back. Or I feel like a 5-year-old who was just completely dismissed and alone. And we'll start to work with what was going on at that time in your life? What did you need that you didn't get? And we'll identify that, the helper, the fixer, that how can we make that healthy? It's healthy to be helpful, but can we make it, often smaller? It doesn't need to be your whole world, because you can be a helper and you can be independent and you can be an adult and you can be brave. Like there's so many more parts to you rather than just the role you played in your family.
Right. And that's a big thing to get to the bottom of,
Mm-hmm.
just recognizing what are your motivations, why are you doing it the way you're doing it.
Yep.
And this is why they'll say also that in these cases, it's just good to get it on paper, get it out there, and just be aware of what it is. And a powerful question I've heard asked is, who did you have to be for your parents to love you? And just even answering that question can go a really far way. And you would see the roles probably in how somebody answers that question. The golden child would say, well, I had to do this, this, and this to meet their expectations. The helper would be like, well, if I didn't put things together and try to hold things together, then I wouldn't feel loved. And the scapegoat, they would probably say something along the lines of, I didn't feel loved unless I was unheard or just kind of hid. But it would be interesting to hear what a scapegoat would say to that question. Probably just a combination of all of them, if I had to guess, because if they're being criticized and belittled, what do you do? What do you do? What makes you think you're being loved in that case? What person do you have to be if just by being who you are is getting you criticized, is getting you devalued and belittled? So I don't know. It would depend on each individual situation, but
yeah, I think they might even say, I have to have a problem to keep people around.
that's a good, okay. I could see that for sure. And that's a shame though, too, right? It's a shame that that's the programming that they've received. That's the conditioning. And all of this, I'm sure it shows back up in their romantic relationships in adulthood. Most likely to show up in the romantic relationships, because those powerful feelings, they bring out this stuff that's on the inside of us. So the golden child's going to have certain issues. The helper is going to have certain issues. The black sheep might have certain issues. The scapegoat. And it's probably really interesting to see how, and maybe interesting isn't the right word, but interesting to see how it shows up in their relationship dynamics.
Yeah. Well, we tend to repeat what we've learned in our families. We start with our family unit and then we generalize out. And so a lot of times people wonder, why am I picking the same kind of person just in a different body? Why do I keep repeating these relationships? Well, because for so long, we are trying to heal the parts of us by finding another relationship, recreating the scenario that mimics our childhood, and then making this one work. Like that subconscious belief is, I'm going to find somebody else that I have to work. I'll just use myself as an example. I have to find somebody else who is kind of dismissive and neglectful and isn't really fully there, but I'm going to work really hard and we're going to work together and we're going to grow together. And then eventually they will, turn into this person that I see that the potential that they could be. And then we're going to support each other and it's going to be great. So you try to find these, or you unknowingly recreate relationships where you can play those patterns out, hoping for a different outcome.
Right. And they try to heal that. And a lot of that can be subconscious too. But I think a lot of the work that you do and that I do is in making some of that stuff conscious. Oh yeah, this is what's going on with this. What are you telling yourself about the situation? How do you think you have to show up to be loved? And just becoming aware of that goes a far
that you're
way.
Even doing it.
Yes, because a lot of people
don't
never
know.
do. Yeah, they just don't do it. They don't ever reflect in that way. So just the fact that they're reflecting in that way, you're already on the right path, and they should give themselves a pat in the back just for that. Now, to the next topic, though, the co-parenting with a narcissist. Yeah. This is the one that's the biggest fiasco that I see for people, because normally we would all say, go no contact, unsubscribe, block, delete. You don't got to deal with them anymore. But when you have a child with one, that's not an option anymore.
No.
What are your suggestions in this kind of dynamic?
As with any narcissistic relationship, it's really about the mental game. It's about how do you, like you say, which I love, unsubscribe from their reality, because a narcissistic parent is going to push their reality not only in their own world, in their own sphere, but onto the child and onto you. They're trying to reach over into your household and still like have an influence. So what I see people in these situations getting caught up in is they have been so drilled in the courts to not disparage the other parent. Don't talk bad about the other parent. Well, first of all, a healthy parent is the only one who will be concerned about that and follow it. The narcissistic parent's going to completely ignore it. They're going to continue talking bad about you. They do not care. They do not follow custody arrangements or agreements. So now you're left with, well, I don't want to say anything bad. So then they try to avoid talking about the narcissistic parent altogether. I'm just going to act like that doesn't exist. We're just going to have our life over here. And then when my child brings up something about the other parent, the narcissistic parent, some people just freeze. Some people don't know what to say. Some people change the subject. So I encourage people not to do that. You don't have to talk bad about somebody to bring reality into the situation. The first most important thing is do not make excuses for bad behavior, because I don't care if it's the narcissistic parent, if it's a teacher, if it's a friend, if it's a coach. If they are engaging in lying, manipulating, gaslighting, triangulating, being critical, being rude, you would teach your child those behaviors are not okay. So you don't have to say your dad's such a liar, he's such a manipulator, you can't trust anything he says, or mom or whoever. But you can say, I'm sorry that happened. Do you want to talk about that? How did that feel? That was probably really heavy. I'm so sorry you're going through that. What can I do for you? And you can also talk about behaviors. Lying is not okay. We don't do that here. We are honest, and here's why. Here are the consequences of lying and manipulating people. So you can address behaviors in a general way, just like you would with anybody. Don't be afraid to touch those things, because the child is being impacted by their narcissistic parent. They need you to be the sane one, the healthy one, the one that they can come to when they're stressed, when they're overwhelmed, when they're anxious. And if they feel you tense up anytime they talk about the other parent, they're just not going to talk to you at all about it. And now you've missed the opportunity to help them make sense of these crazy making behaviors.
That's a good way to put it there too. And would that be the most effective strategy that you see people implement, is they do that and they address things? And this is where I think emotional self-control and being able to place boundaries without jading, justify, argue, defend, explain, and over explaining, just like being simple and concise and saying, okay, this is this, or this wasn't acceptable, and this is what has to take place. Because we both know some of these narcissistic parents, they're wiling out with false accusations, trying to weaponize the children against the other parent. And that's another thing we should go over there. How do you handle it with the children? Where I think what I hear a lot of is people ask me, how do I make sure my kids don't become a narcissist, for one? And then two, how do I stop them from being weaponized against me? What do I do in that case if the other parent, the narcissistic parent, is constantly smearing or triangulating or something? What would you recommend in those scenarios?
The number one thing people should be doing is creating a meaningful relationship with your child, regardless of what's going on around you. Because I think sometimes we get caught up in so much of what the narcissistic parent is doing, what's going on in court, what's going on in custody, legal battles. We're so drained. It makes sense, which is why your own self-care and taking care of yourself and all those things are so important. But we're so drained and concerned about trying to manage all these unmanageable things that we fail to be present with our kids. We fail to take those opportunities to help them emotionally regulate, to talk about things that don't matter, like, not that they don't matter, but they're not as, life-altering. Sports, school, what they're interested in, TV shows. Talk about the things that don't matter so that they come to you when there's things that do matter. Don't get so caught up in being concerned about trying to manage everything else that's happening that you miss just being a healthy parent. I will often tell people, what would you be doing? How would you want to show up as a parent if you didn't have a narcissistic co-parent? Like, what values would you want to instill in your child? What would you be doing with them? How would you be spending time with them? And I think that really helps bring power back, helps people feel more empowered because they're like, oh, I can do all these things. I can still have a positive influence. I can show up to their games. I can help them with their homework. I can teach them about honesty and respect and how to create good relationships and empathy. I can be doing all of that, regardless of what the narcissist is doing. So, really focusing on what you can control and creating that relationship with your child is helping your child with those manipulative strategies that the narcissistic co-parent is using, because you're giving them those protective factors. In therapy, we will talk about risk factors and protective factors. And protective factors are those things like resiliency and mental strength and empathy and knowing how to set boundaries. No, you can't take your child out of dealing with that narcissistic parent, but you can teach them how to listen to their intuition. You can acknowledge and validate when they're feeling stressed and overwhelmed every time they come back from the narcissistic parent. You can say, how are you feeling? What is that like in your body? I'm sorry you're going through that. Let's talk about what we can do. You can teach them all of those things regardless of what the narcissist is doing.
Yeah, and that's a good one right there too. That's good to be able to have those open lines of communication with the kids and always be the person that I call it being the safe person, where you can go, they can come to you with anything and you're not going to jump down their throats or something, but they can tell you anything that's going on with them and you're not going to be super judgmental about it and you're just going to listen. I think when people are that version, it does really help them. And then leading by example, like you said, being that person that they think is the best version of a parent they can be. And when they do that, if you don't get caught up in the insanity of it, don't get caught up in the fight and the jading, etc. It's just be you. Take care of what you can take care of. Be the open and safe person for your children. And that's really it. But what else would you say to the kids if you know their parents narcissistic? Would you tell them anything about their dad or mom? Or would you just kind of just let it unravel or just play out naturally?
I think the best chance for kids to see it is when they come to it on their own terms. Even we think as adults, like if we had someone say, hey, that person isn't good for you, how many of us listen to it when we're not ready to? And so same thing with kids who have a vested interest in thinking well of that parent, or at least keeping that attachment there because it is their parent. So you don't want to try to necessarily push the kid not to have an attachment. But like we've been talking about, you do want to give them a safe space to talk about how they're feeling and highlight how you are there for them, regardless of whatever kind of chaos and stress is going on over there. And I do think as they get older, I'm thinking more, I mean, it depends on each case, but adolescents or so, you can share more facts with them. I'm sorry your dad or your mom said that. I'm sure that was really confusing. Here's actually what our agreement is. If it's a co-parenting, like at some point you can say, I've kind of coached people through how do you tell them about courts in an appropriate way. You can say, in general, there are courts and there are laws to help things function smoothly, to give clarity and order. That's why we have traffic lights. That's why we have stop signs. Same thing for families. When families divorce, courts look at the situations and they say, okay, these are the rules that are going to be best for this family at this time. So that's what the court has decided. Your dad or your mom knows this too. They were there. So I'm not sure why they're telling you something else or trying to, get in the middle of it, but here's where it is. Do you have any questions? So you're calm. You are saying in reality.
Right.
Reality is it's not that hard to follow a parental agreement. Pickup is at 4. Drop off is at 6. Like it is not complicated. So you're saying in that reality and saying, these are simple rules. This is what was decided. I'm sorry that the other parent is saying that to you. I'm sure that's really confusing because here's what it is.
Right.
And so then the kid is like, yeah, that makes sense. As long as you don't kind of get drawn into the crazy too, then the child will feel calmer and it will make more sense to them.
Yeah, and I think that's the big part of it too. If the healthy parent, the safe parent can remain calm and not get sucked into it, I think that's like the most powerful thing. And would you recommend like telling the kids, or how about this scenario where the narcissistic parent, maybe they talk trash about the
Hmm.
other parent? Would you ask the children to tell you at that point if the other parent says things about them? Like, before you just believe something that your other parent says, maybe come to me first before you just believe it. Would you even bring the subject
Hmm.
up, or what would you do in that scenario?
I think if you know it's happening, then you can say something like, I know mom or dad might say some bad things about me. And then you can maybe pause and give the child a chance to respond if they want to, and say, if that ever happens, first of all, I'm sorry that they're saying that, because you shouldn't be put in the middle. That's, if they have something to say to me, that's to me, not to you. So I'm sorry that's happening. And talk with them about their feelings about that if they're open to it. And then two, yes, saying, well, if you ever hear anything, I want you to know I'm an open book. So you have any questions, dad or mom says something that's mean or confusing or bad about me, just come talk to me. We'll work it out. I'm an open book. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to tell you, if something isn't true or explain something. If you ever have any questions, just know that line is open.
I think that's a great way to handle it, and definitely not talking trash back about the other
Right.
parents too. That would probably be one of the worst things to do, which is, it might be tempting for some
Very
people, right?
much.
Like if you
100%.
hear, yeah, if you hear the narcissistic parent is coming up with all these lies and saying things that aren't true, it can be upsetting. It can make the other parent upset, and which is understandable.
Yeah.
But even the reactions, too much of a reaction, if the kid sees it, the narcissistic parent would probably say, oh, if your mom or dad gets emotional when they hear that, it means they're guilty. It means they did it. And you'll see, that's what I'm talking about. They're crazy,
Yeah.
see? And that's why
Yeah.
that emotional self-control thing is so big.
Right. And why you can't get pulled into reacting,
Right.
because you're likely correct. That is, a narcissist will try to predict what you're going to do, or tell the child that they're probably going to tell you this, and this about me, or they're so emotional, they're so controlling, they're so sensitive. And then if you have that reaction, which 100% is normal, these are high stakes, high conflict
Sure.
situations, which is why I'm always really encouraging those parents to take care of themselves. And it is not selfish, and it is absolutely necessary to show up as the parent that you want to be. But if you don't respond that way and you do stay calm, at least in front of your child, you may call your therapist or your friend later and like completely vent about it. But in front of your child, if you can remain calm and you can remain just emotionally consistent, that will prove itself over time, because you want to differentiate yourself from the narcissistic parent. The child is already likely confused and like not knowing, sometimes who to believe or what's happening. But if you consistently are going to show them over time that you're emotionally stable, you're, consistent with them, you're present with them, you put them first, you help them out, you're empathetic, that's going to show itself.
That makes a lot of sense. And what would you say to a parent on how to cope with when the
Mm-hmm.
narcissistic parent lies and smears, etc.? Because it is hard. What are your recommendations for them to not let it bother them, and or to play it cool? What are your suggestions?
Yeah. And I don't know that it ever doesn't bother us. I
Right.
think, when we're triggered, you have that immediate nervous system reaction. So first of all, let's just be realistic that your palms are probably going to sweat, your stomach is going to churn, and your heart's going to race as soon as this starts happening.
Mm.
And so just knowing that triggers validate your reality. They tell you what's happening is real. You wouldn't have triggers if you hadn't been through abuse yourself. And that's part of what makes this so challenging, because those are trauma triggers from
Right.
your time with a narcissistic parent. So you're also not always going to get it perfect. I know we're talking here, and it does work. I've seen it work over and over again, what we're talking about using these strategies. But that doesn't mean you get it perfect every time.
Right.
Sometimes maybe you've had a really stressful day and you react a little bit more than you want to. Also, don't think you can't go back to your child and say, hey, I have a really long and stressful day, and that's no excuse. I got frustrated. I just wanted to come back, touch base, say, I'm sorry. Was there anything else that you wanted to say about that? Don't think you can't go back. either, because that actually goes a long way with your child. There's something called good enough parenting. And it means that you don't have to be a perfect parent. In fact, no one is going to be. But even if you did, that would probably set an unrealistic standard for your child.
Right.
And then they're going to feel not enough.
Right.
So good enough parenting is you show up the best you can. And when you don't, you take ownership of it, you acknowledge it, you address it with them, and then you move on. So that's why taking care of yourself is so important.
Yeah. And what you just said is really so powerful too, where just giving themselves a break, not beating themselves up about it, and coming back to something if you did have a little bit of an emotional reaction, and going back to your kid and saying, yeah, I had a long day. And just that little thing where they can see you come back to emotional regulation, I think that's so key. And one of the things I say to people that are dealing with narcissistic people is see them as an emotional 5-year-old, or just imagine them as being a 5-year-old, because it's one of the things that, at least for me, it disempowers them a little bit in my mind, and say, okay, if a 5-year-old said this, would I be really upset? Probably not. It might still, like, it can sting, whatever, but it won't be as bad. And that's why I recommend people to see it that way, just to soften the blow a little bit. And because it still might hurt, but maybe not as much. Because the reality is, in these worst cases, they really are mentally 5 years old, pretty much. They are acting on 5-year-old defense mechanisms a lot of times. And it comes off as really childish, really argumentative, all the things that we know. But those would be my suggestions for it.
I like that too. Yeah, they are emotionally immature. That's part of narcissism, is that emotional dysregulation and wanting to be controlling, of course, and entitled and everything that goes with that. But yeah, if you can just know that the narcissist also ramps up the more that they feel like they're losing power. So the fact that the more you are consistent and stable and empathetic with your child, and the narcissistic parent also sees that and sees that they have a good relationship, and they start to see that they're losing control over their child's mental and emotional world, and that the child is actually having a healthy relationship with you, that may also be why the narcissist is pushing harder. So just remember that narcissists tend to get worse or more antagonistic if life isn't going well for them. And just keeping that in mind, that maybe part of the reason that they're doing whatever they're doing or saying what they're saying is because you are doing your job.
Right. And that's one way I see the narcissistic parent exercise control too. They get really stringent on the rules of, okay, bring the kids here at this time, pick them up at this time, you better do this, this, and this. And that's just really their avenue to try to control them through the only way they still can, is through the kids. And is there a way to cope with that part of it too, when they're really trying to be really strict and controlling with just that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, you're so right that when the more that narcissists feel like they're losing control, sometimes they will all of a sudden care about the rules. Whereas maybe your parenting agreement always said you were supposed to meet at 4, but you've always met at 4:30, and now they're like, "Why are you late? We're supposed to meet at 4." And it's like, we've never followed that. You've never followed that. So that's one of those things, again, where you have to be doing your own work. You have to come back and emotionally regulate. That's one of the most important parts that I work with people who are in these situations. Is it's like living with a chronic illness. It's not something where you go to the doctor or you get something medicine and you feel better. We're in it for the long game. So mental strength, mental resiliency, we have to be intentional about building that ourselves.
Absolutely. And the final topic here I'd like to go over, because this is something that I see people struggle with months to years after a relationship with the narcissist ends, but the ruminating period, where they can't stop beating themselves up, or they just can't stop thinking about the narcissist or wanting to reach out. And there might still even be no contact. They might not even be acting on it, but they still get those thoughts. They still ruminate, and they still can be like obsessive about it. What would you recommend for people in that scenario?
Well, I think ruminating, especially in regard to narcissistic relationships, often gets a bad rap. And it's like the worst of the worst. And it is. It's one of the consistent, hands down across the board, one of the biggest symptoms of narcissistic abuse, and a sign that you're in a narcissistic relationship is when you can't stop ruminating. You leave conversations feeling more confused than when you started them. So it's not only a sign, but it's a symptom that continues even if the relationship has ended. So first of all, I like people to understand that rumination isn't necessarily bad. It's your brain's way of trying to make sense of things. It's you keep going back to the relationship and like circling that drain again because you're like, no, that doesn't make sense. And then they said this, but then this happened, but they did this. And so a lot of people are still stuck in rumination because they're confused. So I find a lot of times that there's a lot of power in retelling your story. And like we were talking about a bit earlier, it's a different, even writing it down can be helpful. But if you can find a therapist or a coach or a good friend or someone that you can kind of replay this out with over and over and over again, and you're able to even get their feedback or get their validation. And if you're in a professional relationship, you know, they might be able to help you work through, oh, that was the gaslighting or that was the triangulation. Well, that's when they were love bombing you. So that's why they said this and did this. I've had so many clients have those light bulb moments. And I know for me and myself in my own therapy work, it was when I retold it that I realized what had happened. And it almost like the dust settled more. There's a lot of power in retelling your story because that's when you start to really get to take your power back because now you're defining what happened. For so long, the narcissist is owning reality. But before you even know it, as soon as they enter your life, they're trying to own reality. They get to define words like what it means to be loyal and forgiving. That's why they say you're being disloyal if you set boundaries, or you're disloyal if you walk away. Like they own your feelings, they own your reality, they own your thoughts, they own everything. So when you get to retell it to somebody and say, no, that's not what happened. This is what happened. This is how I felt. Walking away from abuse is not disloyalty. It's self-respect. Then some of the rumination will slow down.
I actually love that. I love the idea of retelling the story and rewriting the story. And you might not even need to share it to anybody else, but just write it for yourself and say, yeah, if that's what they thought loyalty was, define your version of loyalty or fill in the blank with whatever nonsense they would pull. You define it for yourself because the narcissistic person or any kind of abuser, they define reality. And when people are subscribed to that defined reality, that's when they jump through the hoops. That's when they're trying to please the other person, but the goalposts keep on moving. So I think the idea of redefining it and retelling the story from your empowered perspective, I think that can go a really far away and that's probably the only way to really make sense of it because their behavior isn't rational. Like there's you can't rationalize an irrational thing. Their disordered thinking is irrational and you can't get to, because people will try to jump through the hoops and try to make sense of it and say, oh, if I just did it this way, if I just did it that way, or if I said it this way, they wouldn't have gotten upset. It's like, no matter what you did or no matter what you said, they were going to be upset at some point and they were going to find a problem with it at some point. That's the irrational part. But rationally, when you retell the story, like you said, I think I'm going to start telling people to do that. It's a great idea. But you rewrite that story in particular. And if you want to dig deep with it, this is what I would say too. You think about the stuff they would gaslight you the most on, or the things they would try to control you the most on, and then really make sure you emphasize defining your reality in those areas. And to me, that's one of the ways to become gaslighting proof as well. I tell people, think about the ways that you've been gaslit in the past. Were they about particular subjects? Were they about particular events or character traits? Explore those and see, because often narcissistic people or abusers, they're really good at like pushing those buttons in people. Like they know the buttons to push because they know the vulnerabilities. And so I try to tell people, empower those vulnerabilities. So like if they're hitting that button because you think there's a little truth in it, own whatever it is. Own the flaw or own the fact that you're not perfect. And I think when we own it, that's another way to disempower it too. But yeah, writing and rewriting the story, and for all the people watching this, I want you all to do that. Rewrite the story and do it in a way that empowers you. I love that.
Yep. Yeah. And it's the truth, it is your story.
Right.
And you're also just telling the truth because, yeah, you lived it, but you lived in the distortion. You lived in the lie and the manipulation, and you were trying to make sense of it as it was happening.
Right.
Now you say what's really true. So many of my sessions will start with like this jumbled mess of like yarn that's just been tossed around and people don't know what in the world to do with it. And by the end of the session, they're like, oh, that's like neatly over there to the side. I get it now. Because what we've done is taken this chaos that the narcissist created and that makes no absolute sense. And you're trying to make sense of it based on who you are and having a healthy self-reflection. You're trying to assume that, oh, they probably didn't mean that and they meant well. And you're trying to make sense of it based on how would I ever do something like that? Like what would have to happen? And what would I be thinking if I did that? No. Right. Because you are not going to think, you're not a narcissist. Right. So you cannot think like that. But once we put that narcissist like lens on it, like we put on our narcissist glasses and we're like, okay, well, I see the world through a really entitled lens and I'm also always the victim and always right. Now everything pretty much makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that also helps just people to heal the trauma bond, lose attraction for them. When you see beneath the mask and you see that what you thought was real really wasn't real. Like that wasn't like during the love bombing phase. That really wasn't them. That was just their front to manipulate you, basically. And I think when people can really see underneath that, it does disempower the narcissistic person. And you can't be attracted to that anymore. Like even the trauma bonded parts, you can still see through it, I think, once you really see them for what it really is. Once you see them for what it really is, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Yeah.
At that point. I mean, that's a good thing in this case, where you see it, you just know what it is. And so I think that really helps people.
Exactly. Yep. I could speak from personal experience. Like if you ever look at, your, or my clients, if they look at their exes or they look at previous things that, attracted you to them, and then you see them for who they really are, you go through the devalue and the discard, let's say you're not together. Then you look at them and you see the same things because guess what? They're playing the same game with a new person. You're like, you're disgusted by it. You're like, that is not attract. Like you said, it's lost its power. You're not attracted to that anymore because now whatever it was they had, the attraction, the money, the status, the appearance, whatever it was you were attracted to them about, now you know it's fake. So it almost gives you that icky feeling.
Right. And I would say to people also, if they catch themselves reminiscing about the good times, to make sure they fast forward those tapes and say, don't stop short. Don't stop short of just the maybe fun times, whatever they were. Because I think it's important to remember it wasn't all bad. Like there were things that were good, which is part of what made it last as long as it did in a lot of cases. It wasn't just the stages aren't going to be linear, like love bombing, devalue, discard. It's like, no, there's going to be love bombing and then devaluing and then back to love bombing again intermittently. And that keeps people stuck. But knowing that the love bombing, not really real, and then fast forward those tapes to see, the cycle is just going to repeat. The devaluing is going to get worse, or the discard will be even more harsh the next time. And I think it's important to keep those tapes rolling. Don't stop short at the good if they do.
Yeah, exactly. Because that doesn't tell the whole story.
Right.
Anyone can create a nice day or a good date or a short amount of time, but someone shows us who they really are over time, consistently.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything else you wanted to mention here to put a bow on any of these three topics that we talked about?
I hope this resonated with people. I know there's so many layers to narcissistic abuse. I think there's so much empowerment in just understanding it. And even if you've scratched the surface or maybe you've done a deep dive into narcissism, but if you still find yourself ruminating or getting caught and thinking that the narcissist behaviors don't make sense, go back to the basics. Entitlement, a victim mentality. They're always right. They're never wrong. Start putting that framework on anything that's still not making sense or any kind of rumination, because I guarantee you, once you see something from a narcissist lens, it makes sense. And then once it makes sense, you release yourself from carrying the guilt and the shame and the should I have done something else? Could I have said something else? What could I have made this work? That falls away once you see what it really is.
Right. And that is the one case where I would say to people, when you learn about narcissism, there's plenty of content out there from people like you and me and many
Yep.
others that it is good to learn about it. Like once you learn, I think it does help. It helps you make sense of what was impossible to make sense of before. But I do think there's a time to move on through it too. I don't tell people to stay obsessed with learning. And I think there does get a point where they can learn about it, but then they might come back for reminders or something like that, but they don't think of anyone specific anymore. And I always tell people, remember the lesson, but you can forget the person. You forget the person, but remember the lesson that person was there. That's the part you shouldn't forget, but don't dwell on it either. I would also say you don't dwell on it, but you don't forget it, because you don't want it to be repeated, of course. But
Yep. And that's why in my book, like a third of it is dedicated to understanding narcissism, but 2/3 of it is based on how do you heal your own attachment wounds, relational trauma, break the trauma bonds, experience post-traumatic growth, like where you really get to move past the narcissistic, well, you move past it, but you learn how to deal with your triggers and you really start to heal and you feel like more like yourself again, or you find yourself, because it can be too heavy. And if you're getting to the point where you feel like looking at the narcissism content, you're feeling worse, rather than having those aha moments, probably it's time to take a break, step away, move on to how do I build mental strength and resiliency and boundaries and your healing work.
yeah, I mean, I like that ratio you have there too in the book, like 2/3 of dealing with you, 1/3 learning about them, because it is entertaining even learning about the narcissistic stuff as well. And even if someone isn't a full-blown narcissist, I think you, like me, we both believe that it's a spectrum and there's like less severe versions and there's more severe versions. But just learning about just the manipulation tactics, regardless of the label of someone who is doing them, I think that is really important, because you see those dynamics everywhere. It's not just with narcissists. All sorts of people can minimize. All sorts of people can flip the script or play the victim or fill in the blank. And I think that just helps you in the school of life, just learning how to people and communicate. It's important to know. And I think it helps your self-awareness, I think, as well, when you learn about it. And the other thing I really want to mention is people tend to think, oh, learning about narcissism is ruining all of these relationships out there. They're being ruined because they're learning about narcissism. I say, no, the only relationships that are getting ruined from somebody learning about narcissism are people that are doing those things. The people who are doing
the
those
narcissistic
tactics.
relationships.
Yeah. Everyone else, it's only going to help a healthy relationship, because no one's perfect. Everyone might do something like to have defects or whatever, and people are going to do things occasionally, and it's important to be able to identify it in ourselves too. If we catch ourselves doing any of the things, I think that helps. The self-awareness helps. And I don't see it ruin healthy relationships. I put it like that. I see it ruin relationships where someone has a narcissistic adaptation and they can't take accountability and they're constantly blaming others. Those relationships might get ruined, but not good ones. Not good ones. And I know I've been criticized for that. The narcissistic guys will inbox me, "You ruined my marriage." I'm like, I ruined your marriage? I don't know who you are. And I can only imagine that's probably what he's doing to his wife at home when she tries to talk about anything with him. Not his fault, someone else's fault, but certainly not his fault. So I say, of course, you're blaming me because she educated herself on narcissism or whatever. And now it's my fault for just talking about it online, that your marriage ended. It's like, no, take a look in the mirror there, pal. Take some accountability. There's probably something going on there. But that's just an example of something that I see.
Yeah, I can see that as well. I think the narcissistic people are definitely more likely to have a problem with the narcissistic content out there.
Yeah.
And I know, both of our intention is to educate and to help and to validate people's experiences. And I always say, if this doesn't resonate with you, it's not for you.
Right.
If you read this and you're like, no, that doesn't apply to me, great, then it doesn't apply to you. But it does apply to people who are going through these relationships.
Right. And I'll say this too. I always say behaviors are more important than the labels anyway,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you believe it's a spectrum. I think it's the behaviors that matter. If someone's gaslighting, flipping the script, or being abusive, it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter what you call it. Those
Yeah,
behaviors are the problem. And
right.
what that other person needs to do is going to be the same regardless of the label you put on that person. And that's why
Right.
the labels help people find our stuff, but ultimately the behaviors are more important to me. And I'm all for people that maybe are self-aware narcissists out there. Like, contrary to popular belief, there are some. And I would
Mm-hmm.
say I encourage them to do the work, to take accountability. I think it's great that they can admit it, because that's something a lot of people just can't do. They can't
Mm-hmm.
admit it, and then they're not willing to put in any footwork. But I would caution people, if they're with someone like that, you really got to make sure they're doing that footwork. They can't just be talking it.
Mm-hmm.
They got to be doing that footwork. But I encourage everyone to do the footwork for sure. And I'm glad that they can admit it if they do, because I mean, why not? What's the downside of them being able to admit it and then take a look at their own side of the street and try to improve?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. If anyone's willing to do the work, then good. I mean, whether narcissistic or not, I have and do work with some self-aware narcissists. I don't work with the ones who aren't self-aware because they don't think that they need therapy.
Right, right.
But for the ones who are self-aware, it's if they're willing to do the work. However, that we're talking about micro changes here. Personality
Sure.
is pretty rigid, pretty
Right.
set once we get to be an adult. So you're not going to take a narcissistic person and then be highly empathetic and emotionally regulated.
Right.
It's going to be a micro change, and that may not be enough for the people around them, but it's something we can work with in therapy and coaching to try to help them be a better person and not harm others as
Sure.
much.
I think behavior modification, I think, is
Yeah.
possible. They might not be able to change their internal landscape, and you might not be able to learn emotional empathy, but I think
Yeah.
you might be able to learn cognitive empathy. And I think you can try to learn behavior modification, like learning how to
Hmm.
take a step back and
Right.
learn to respond as opposed to react. I do think that's possible. And in that context, I have seen people that, especially when it coincides with another major change, like they were struggling with drugs or alcohol, and then they
Yeah.
stop, and then they do some work. Okay, yeah, I've seen people make some pretty drastic turnarounds. I don't talk about it very much, but because I think it's important for those actions to really do the talking, and I don't want to emphasize the part that some people might be able to improve, when in the majority of cases that is not what is happening. In fact, it's the
Mm.
opposite. They're getting worse, and their denial is worse, or their manipulation gets worse. So I don't emphasize the maybe they can improve part, because a lot of them just won't.
Won't. And it's such a rarity. It's much more likely that
Right.
that will be used to harm people
Yeah,
than to help people.
exactly. And that's why we didn't talk about this till the end of this, for
Yeah.
one. And I don't talk about it. I occasionally will mention it, but anyone who wants to do the work, whether it's a narcissistic person, a borderline person, or
Hmm.
CPTSD, the work's going to be the work. And if somebody wants it enough, they're going to go seek it. They're going to go do it if they want it enough. And those actions, they're going to be the bottom line. And if they don't see
Yep.
those actions, nothing's going to change. Nothing changes. Nothing changes.
No. And too few are willing to do the work. And so I think it does more harm than good to say, oh, it's possible, when we're talking about like a 1% or so change. Kit, you
he
just had to make a scene.
he agrees. He agrees.
That's right. He's like, yes, I think so.
So to wrap up here, you have your book, If Only I'd Known, that's out right now. on Instagram and Facebook, Chelsey Brooke
Mhm.
Cole. Anywhere else people can find you?
I am also on Twitter and TikTok and LinkedIn, but Facebook's definitely my biggest platform. Have a lot of great support there, and Instagram. Those are my two biggest ones.
All righty. Thank you very much for coming on the show today, Chelsey. I
Thank
think
you.
it was really informative. I think we did a deep dive here on those 3 topics. And I think people who are actually in those issues, I think they will be greatly helped from what you had to say about it there. And I think they'll have some practical things to apply to their lives, especially with the ruminating too, rewriting that story. Everyone should be doing that. Everyone who is in a narcissistic relationship, rewrite that story. That's a great way to empower yourself. I love that you said that.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really hope it was helpful.
I know it will be. I know it will be. All right. Thanks again. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Think.